Welcome to the channel. I'm so glad you're here to join us for today's story. If you're new, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on the amazing stories we have coming up each day. Before we dive into the tale, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing about all the places you're tuning in from. Your feedback and thoughts mean the world to me, so feel free to share your thoughts as we go along. Stay tuned for more captivating stories, and let's get started. How a royal guard showed a teen what true strength really is. Jake was 17, a high school junior, living in a quiet suburb of New York. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly fine. He came from a family that had everything he could ever need: financial security, a roof over his head, food on the table, and all the material possessions a teenager could wish for. But beneath that facade, Jake struggled with something far more important: a lack of direction and purpose in life. At school, Jake was always just getting by. He wasn't the most brilliant student, nor was he the worst. He'd pass his classes, sometimes with effort, sometimes by the skin of his teeth. But the motivation to really excel was simply not there. Every test, every project, felt like a task to be checked off, not an opportunity to learn or grow. It was like he was going through the motions, but never feeling fully alive in what he was doing. And it wasn't just in school. Jake found himself caught in a web of empty habits. He spent hours scrolling through his phone, looking at what others were doing, comparing himself to friends and strangers who seemed to have it all figured out. He was constantly distracted, hopping from one activity to another, but never finding anything that truly gave him a sense of accomplishment or fulfillment. His relationships weren't much better. He had friends, of course, but they were mostly just people he hung out with when there was nothing better to do. He didn't feel deeply connected to anyone, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a meaningful conversation. When it came to family, Jake just existed. There was no real connection or understanding between him and his parents. They cared about him, but the communication between them was strained and shallow. Jake felt like he was just a passive observer in his own life, watching things happen around him, but never truly engaging. Jake didn't realize it at the time, but he had unknowingly created a comfort zone for himself, a place where nothing ever changed. And in that space, he was slowly losing touch with his true potential. He was, in essence, going through life with no clear goal or sense of self-worth. Everything was temporary, and nothing felt permanent enough to make him invest his energy or emotions into it. One of the hardest things for Jake to accept was that he had no sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life, what he was passionate about, or where he was headed. He saw others around him excelling, friends who had their futures mapped out, athletes and students who had a clear vision of their goals. But for Jake, that clarity seemed out of reach. He didn't know where he was going, and it was starting to eat away at him. To cope with this, Jake kept himself busy with distractions: video games, social media, aimless wandering, anything to avoid thinking about his lack of direction. But deep down, he knew that these things weren't solving the problem. They were just filling the empty space temporarily. Every time he stopped to think, a nagging voice in his mind reminded him that he wasn't living up to his potential, that he wasn't truly fulfilling what he was capable of. Jake had become trapped in a cycle of avoidance. He was avoiding difficult conversations with his family about his future. He was avoiding commitment to anything that required real effort, because that meant confronting the fear of failure and rejection. And most importantly, he was avoiding facing the truth about himself, that he was drifting through life without any real purpose. As the days passed, Jake's feelings of confusion and frustration grew. It wasn't just about school or family. It was about the bigger picture. The lack of purpose in his life was starting to feel suffocating. He didn't know how to fix it, but he was becoming more and more aware that something needed to change. Little did he know, his moment of transformation was just around the corner. It was a sunny spring day when Jake's family decided to take a trip across the pond to London. They had planned the vacation for months, and Jake, though reluctant at first, couldn't ignore the excitement that came with the prospect of seeing the world. The flight had been long, but as the plane touched down on British soil, Jake was eager to see something new. Little did he know, this trip would be the turning point in his life. One of the first places on their itinerary was the historic Tower of London. Jake had heard about the tower in history class, but standing before it, he was struck by its sheer size, its ancient stone walls, and the weight of centuries of history that hung in the air. But what really caught Jake's attention wasn't the tower itself. It was the soldiers stationed around it, the royal guards. These men, standing motionless like statues, were a symbol of unwavering discipline, and Jake couldn't help but be drawn to them. As they approached the entrance, Jake saw Lance Corporal Ryan Matthews, a royal guard in his full uniform, tall and imposing, standing perfectly still, eyes locked straight ahead. The sun glinted off his polished boots and the metal of his ceremonial armor, making him seem almost otherworldly. Around him, the crowd buzzed with excitement, taking pictures, making comments, and even joking about how hard the guard's job must be. But Matthews didn't flinch. He didn't smile or engage with anyone. He simply stood, like a living monument, unmoving amidst the chaos. Jake couldn't help but watch him. There was something captivating about how still he was, how focused, how impervious to the noise around him. He thought about how often he, himself, had been distracted, how easy it was for him to give up when things got tough. And here was this man standing in front of a sea of people, with nothing but his duty and his discipline to guide him. Then, it happened. A group of tourists, mostly young people, began to approach Matthews. They joked loudly about how funny it would be if they could make him smile. One of them started asking him questions, teasing him, and even trying to touch his hat. The laughter of the group echoed through the courtyard. Jake could see Matthew's eyes flicker just slightly, but nothing else changed. He didn't react. He didn't move a muscle. The crowd grew louder, but Matthews remained the same. Silent, stoic, a rock in the middle of the storm. Jake could feel the tension in the air. He had expected the guard to snap, to say something, to at least shift his weight. But Matthews did nothing. There was a quiet strength in his stillness, a strength that Jake hadn't expected. In that moment, something clicked for him. This wasn't just about standing still. It was about maintaining a standard, a level of professionalism that transcended the noise of the world. Jake's mind raced. How could Matthews be so unaffected by all of this? How could he endure the teasing, the mocking, and the sheer chaos surrounding him without losing his composure? Jake felt a wave of admiration wash over him. He realized, for the first time, that the lack of purpose he felt wasn't something that could be filled with distractions or empty achievements. It was about finding something worth standing for. It was about commitment and resilience. Matthews wasn't just standing guard over the Tower of London. He was standing guard over something much bigger: tradition, duty, and honor. Jake looked at the guard for what felt like hours, watching him maintain his perfect stance, unwavering and calm. He realized that in Matthews' stillness there was a powerful lesson. The kind of discipline and commitment Matthews had wasn't something that could be faked or bought. It was built over years of practice, of learning how to endure, how to be steady even when the world around you is anything but. As they left the tower later that afternoon, Jake couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. He realized he had been looking for motivation in all the wrong places, through distractions, through comparisons, through empty goals. But there, in that courtyard, amidst the noise and chaos, he had seen true discipline in action. He wasn't sure how, but he knew that somehow he needed to take that lesson home with him. This was the moment Jake realized that his lack of purpose wasn't something he could run away from or ignore. It was something he needed to confront, and it was time for him to start standing still, too. To find his own purpose, to be as steady as the guard who had taught him, without a single word, what it truly meant to stand for something. The weeks after Jake's trip to London had been a quiet storm. His life was still filled with the usual distractions, but something had shifted. That quiet, disciplined presence of Lance Corporal Ryan Matthews at the Tower of London had left an indelible mark on him. He couldn't stop thinking about the Matthews stood stoically in the face of a noisy, disrespectful crowd, unmoved, unmoving, and utterly unshaken. Jake realized for the first time that discipline wasn't just about following the rules. It was about sticking to something when the world around you was constantly trying to pull you off course. So, Jake began to apply the lessons he'd learned in small, everyday ways. He woke up earlier each day, setting aside the first hour to work on himself. No more snoozing the alarm or wasting time scrolling through social media. He started paying attention in class, taking notes carefully, and organizing his work in a way he'd never bothered to before. For the first time in his life, Jake wasn't just going through the motions. He was genuinely engaging with his life. But as with any transformation, the road wasn't smooth. A few weeks into his new routine, Jake was faced with an unexpected test. One afternoon, he received a text from his best friend, Ethan, that rattled him to his core. Ethan had been his closest ally, the one friend who'd stuck by him through everything. The message read, "Jake, I need to talk. It's about Sarah." Jake's heart sank. Sarah was someone he had secretly liked for months, but he'd never had the courage to tell her. He wasn't sure what Ethan meant by, "It's about Sarah," but he had a sinking feeling that his friend was about to drop a bombshell. A part of him wanted to brush it off, ignore it, but another part knew that this was the kind of moment where he would have to make a choice that would test everything he had learned so far. He called Ethan immediately, his palms sweaty. "What's going on, man?" Ethan's voice was low, almost apologetic. "Look, Jake, I didn't want to be the one to tell you this, but Sarah and we've been talking, and, well, it's more than that. We've been hanging out, and honestly, I think we're kind of a thing now." Jake felt his stomach drop. The old version of him would have reacted instantly. Anger, jealousy, frustration. He'd have confronted Ethan, said something he'd regret, and probably lost a friend over it. But this was different. He took a deep breath, and just like Lance Corporal Matthews, he focused. He wasn't going to let his emotions dictate his actions. "All right," Jake replied, his voice steady. "I'm not happy about it, but I'll handle it. Thanks for telling me." "Are you sure you're okay with this?" Ethan asked, sounding unsure. Jake closed his eyes, remembering Matthews, the stillness, the control. "Yeah, I'll be fine." After ending the call, Jake felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt betrayed by his best friend. On the other, there was a strange calmness inside him. He realized that this was his test, how to handle a personal setback without letting it consume him. He had learned to stay disciplined and to remain focused, and now, more than ever, he had to prove to himself that he could handle life's curveballs with the same composure. The next day, at school, Jake saw Sarah and Ethan sitting together talking and laughing. Old Jake would have stormed over, confronted them, maybe even said something hurtful. But instead, he took a breath and walked past them with his head held high. He had no control over their actions, but he had control over how he responded. The days passed. Jake's emotions simmered down. He focused on his studies, putting in the effort to keep his mind occupied and engaged. He didn't dwell on Sarah or Ethan. He recognized that life was full of these kinds of challenges, disappointments, betrayals, and things beyond his control. But his response to them was what mattered most. Then, the ultimate test came. Jake's family sat him down one evening with news that sent shockwaves through him. They were moving. His father had received a job offer in California, and they would be relocating in just 2 weeks. The familiar streets of New York, the school, the friends, everything Jake knew was about to be left behind. He felt his heart race, and the old feelings of resistance, frustration, and fear flooded his mind. For a moment, Jake wanted to lash out, to reject the move, to make everyone around him feel the same anger he was feeling. But then, he thought of Lance Corporal Matthews again. Matthews didn't flinch at the chaos. He didn't let distractions or disrespect shake him. Jake closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and felt the stillness inside him grow stronger. This wasn't the first challenge he had faced, and it wouldn't be the last. "Okay," Jake said, surprising himself with the calmness in his voice. "I'll deal with it. We'll make it work." The move was difficult, and the transition was hard. But Jake stayed grounded. He focused on the positives, a new chapter, new opportunities, a chance to grow. When he started his new school, it felt like walking into the unknown. But instead of retreating, instead of becoming overwhelmed by fear, Jake embraced the challenge with the same discipline he had learned. He made new friends, excelled in his studies, and most importantly, he didn't let anything, no matter how big or small, shake his resolve. The weeks after Jake's move to California were filled with the unsettling challenge of starting fresh. He'd left everything behind, his friends, his school, his life in New York, and although he'd told himself that the move would be an opportunity for growth, he quickly realized that staying disciplined in this new environment was much harder than he'd imagined. New distractions popped up at every turn, people who didn't know him, the pressure to fit in, the overwhelming desire to retreat to the comfort of his old habits. Jake felt lost at first, unsure of how to balance the new chaos around him with the self-discipline he'd been working so hard to build. But despite the discomfort, something in him was changing. He began to realize that the lesson from Lance Corporal Ryan Matthews, the unwavering discipline of standing firm in the face of adversity, was exactly what he needed now more than ever. The real test came unexpectedly one afternoon, when Jake received a message from Ethan, his best friend back in New York. The message was short but heavy with meaning. "Jake, I need to talk. I messed up. Can we meet?" Jake's heart sank as old emotions flooded his mind. He hadn't heard from Ethan since the fallout between them, since the moment Ethan had pursued Sarah, the girl Jake secretly liked. At first, Jake wanted to ignore the message. He'd felt betrayed, and the thought of facing Ethan again stirred up the anger he'd tried so hard to suppress. But as he thought about it, Jake knew this was a crucial moment. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about Jake's ability to stand firm in his principles, to respond with maturity rather than impulse. With a deep breath, he replied, "Sure, let's meet at the park." When they met, Jake could see the guilt on Ethan's face. The old version of Jake might have confronted him angrily, calling him out for what had happened. But instead, Jake took a steadying breath. Ethan apologized profusely, admitting that he'd made a mess of things, that he'd been lost and didn't know how to handle his feelings. Ethan was vulnerable, asking for Jake's forgiveness, but Jake felt the old frustration bubbling up inside him. The temptation to let it all out, to confront Ethan and make him understand how much he'd hurt him, was strong. But then Jake remembered Matthews. He thought about how the soldier had remained composed, unwavering, even when provoked. That memory became his anchor. Instead of reacting immediately, Jake paused, letting the anger pass. He looked Ethan in the eyes and said, "I'm not okay with what happened, and I'm not saying I'm fine with everything. But I think I've learned something important, something I want to apply here. Holding on to this anger won't help either of us. I'm willing to move forward, but it's going to take time." Ethan seemed relieved, but the weight of the conversation lingered. Jake didn't offer forgiveness just yet, but he understood now that letting go of his anger was the only way forward. This was a critical turning point for Jake. He wasn't just learning to be disciplined in his schoolwork anymore. He was learning to apply that discipline to his emotions, his relationships, and his personal growth. The weeks that followed were far from easy. Jake struggled with moments of doubt, especially when school became overwhelming. But he kept himself grounded, remembering the discipline he had learned from Matthews. He joined a few clubs at his new school to stay engaged, and he focused on his grades with renewed determination. He didn't let the distractions of new friendships or the loneliness of being far from home derail him. Slowly, Jake began to realize that the principles of discipline weren't just about getting things done. They were about staying true to himself, no matter the circumstances. One day, Jake's teacher, Mrs. Walker, pulled him aside after class. "Jake," she said with a warm smile, "your recent project was excellent. You've really stepped up in your work this semester. I'm impressed by the dedication and insight you've shown. You've really come a long way." Jake felt a wave of pride. It wasn't just about the grades or the recognition. It was about knowing that he had earned this growth, that he had pushed through the challenges and stayed true to the person he was trying to become. The satisfaction wasn't in the outcome. It was in the journey, the daily effort to stay disciplined, to remain calm when things got tough, and to never lose sight of his values. The discipline that Matthews had shown in standing still at the Tower of London was now a part of Jake. He wasn't just standing still anymore. He was moving forward with purpose and integrity. And for the first time in his life, Jake felt proud of who he was becoming. The weeks after Jake's conversation with Ethan were a period of intense self-reflection. On the surface, everything seemed to be going well. He was adjusting to his new school in California, keeping up with his studies, and sticking to the disciplined routine he had set for himself. But deep down, he knew there was a storm brewing, a storm that had nothing to do with the move or school. It was about the deeper, more personal conflict he hadn't fully dealt with. Jake's internal battle had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. The self-doubt, the insecurity, the fear of failure. He had tried to bury those feelings with his newfound discipline and routines, but they always crept back when things got quiet. He thought back to the days when he felt like he was simply going through the motions of life, trying to please others, trying to fit in, and always afraid of not measuring up. That fear hadn't gone away. It was just quieter now, hidden behind the veneer of his disciplined habits. But then, one day, the storm hit. Jake's class was preparing for a big project presentation. He had been working hard on it, staying up late to perfect every detail. It was his chance to show everyone, his classmates, his teachers, even himself, that he had what it took to succeed. As the presentation day approached, however, Jake began to feel the pressure building. His perfectionism started to rear its ugly head, and with it came the familiar wave of anxiety. The night before the presentation, Jake lay awake in bed, his mind racing. His heart pounded in his chest. What if he messed up? What if his classmates didn't take him seriously? What if the project wasn't good enough? He felt that old fear creeping back, threatening to undo all the progress he had made. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that he wasn't good enough, that he wasn't prepared for this moment. For the first time in weeks, Jake questioned everything. The discipline, the routines, the lessons he had learned from Lance Corporal Matthews. He had worked so hard to stay composed, to stay focused, but now, in the face of this immense pressure, he felt like he was about to crack. He thought about how Matthews had stood so still at the Tower of London, unaffected by the distractions around him. Could Jake do the same? Could he hold his ground in the face of the fear and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm him? The next morning, Jake got up early, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He could barely eat breakfast, his stomach in knots. As he walked to school, he tried to quiet his racing thoughts, but nothing seemed to help. When he arrived at school, he could feel the pressure of the day closing in on him. The presentation loomed ahead, and Jake was more afraid than ever. He kept thinking about Matthews, about standing still in the face of adversity, but the fear felt like it was swallowing him whole. When it was finally his turn to present, Jake stood at the front of the classroom, his hands trembling slightly. His classmates stared at him, some with curious expressions, others with indifferent faces. He took a deep breath and began speaking, his voice shaky at first. But then something shifted. As he talked, he remembered what he had learned from Matthews. He remembered the stillness, the discipline. He focused on the material in front of him, blocking out the fear, the self-doubt, and the anxiety. With each passing minute, he felt the pressure slowly release. His voice grew steadier, more confident, and the fear that had gripped him earlier seemed to fade into the background. By the time Jake finished his presentation, he realized something crucial. The fear hadn't gone away, but he had learned how to face it. He had learned that discipline wasn't just about pushing through the easy moments. It was about standing firm, even when the world around you is shaking. He had learned to confront his own anxiety, to not let it control him, and to trust in the effort he had put in. Jake sat back down, his heart still racing. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of pride. He hadn't let the fear win. He hadn't backed down. And for Jake, that was a victory in itself. What did you think of Jake's journey? How do you handle pressure and challenges in your own life? In the video, we saw Jake struggle with self-doubt, fear, and external pressure. But through his experience, he learned to stay disciplined and face his fears head-on. We'd love to know how you relate to Jake's story and the lessons he learned. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to rise above fear or uncertainty? How did you manage to push through? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, experiences, and advice for others who might be going through similar struggles. It's always powerful when we can learn from each other's journeys. Also, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. We'll be diving deeper into themes of resilience, discipline, and personal growth, and we'd love for you to be part of our growing community. Drop your thoughts below, and let's start a conversation about facing challenges with discipline and determination. Remember, your voice matters here, and we can all grow together.